Hello, everyone. Welcome back to Svelte Sirens. It has been on a little bit of a hiatus, but I am very glad to be back, and I'm so excited to be joined today by Eric from Carbon Components Svelte. And you also created the Sveld, is that how we say it? Sveld
Yeah,
library, docgen library. I'm so glad to have you back on the Svelte Sirens. Do you want to just give just a brief introduction for the audience today?
sure. First off, big thanks for having me on again. I'm Eric. I'm currently a UX engineer at Render, and before that, I was a design technologist at IBM, where I created the Carbon Svelte project, open sourced it, and it started off as a port for the existing React Carbon. And yeah, I'm excited to be here today.
Awesome. Can we touch on that a little bit before we switch over to your slides and your presentation? I
Sure.
want to talk a little bit maybe about what a design system is, what Carbon is, and we talked about React and Svelte. And I know like all of us here probably know what Svelte is. We know what React is, but why do design systems have those labels? Why do we care about frameworks inside of a design system?
Sure. So the simple answer is that is really just ease of reuse, faster development, and especially for like a large company, having a very unified brand. So for example, instead of 4 or 5 competing design systems within one company, it's ideal to have one design language and then a framework of components or Figma files to just reuse so that the end user experience is as consistent as possible.
Yeah, completely agree. And this is a topic that I'm really passionate about. I'm also a design systems engineer, so I'm very in tune with this also. And this is something that's been coming up for me a little bit lately, which is maybe why I brought it up. But I feel like you have to kind of go with what the product is using. So if your company is using a specific framework, you have to be aware of that, and you have to make sure that your design system aligns with that. Design systems can't always be platform agnostic, and they need to make sure that they work well with whatever the product needs to.
Totally.
Yeah. All right. So enough like basic foundational stuff, and we've got some of the terms out of the way. I'm going to hand it off to Eric and step aside, and let's get the presentation out of the way. If you have questions, post them in the comment section, and I will collect all of those. And at the end, we'll come back and we'll ask you some questions. Okay?
Awesome. Perfect.
All right.
Great. So I've got some slides that I'll just go through, and then I've got links interspersed within the slides to go off on a tangent and then discuss a bit more in depth. But really, this is really high level. So again, currently a UX engineer at Render, and then before that, I was at IBM where I worked on Carbon Svelte. And just like a really quick primer background, Carbon Svelte just refers to actually about 4 or 5 packages within this ecosystem. And before that, Carbon is IBM's open source design system. And the doc site is just Carbon Components Svelte on render.com. And so like it's more than just the components. There are icons, pictograms, and charts. And so like really what this talk is about is really positioning this as a retrospective where Carbon Svelte was one of the earliest open source component libraries built specifically for Svelte 3 that was backed by a large tech company. And like pretty much today, the Carbon Components Svelte package has over 3 million downloads. And it was initially open sourced in December of 2019, so about half a year after Svelte 3 came out. So like it's been over 3 years. So like, what are some lessons learned along the way? But first off, like just to start off, what did IBM use Svelte for? So it really started because what was most appealing about Svelte 3, especially compared to Svelte 2 even, was how concise the language syntax actually is. And the whole like built-in reactivity and like just compared to React, for example, it's just a lot less boilerplate and it's arguably a lot more readable. And like it's one of those things where like even code might be very concise, but it doesn't mean it's automatically more maintainable or readable. But like fortunately, Svelte really struck that balance very nicely, and like it, like you know, like what Svelte is really known for is like it looks like plain markup CSS and JavaScript. Yeah, so like just to start off, like open source has been really essential to the development and current progress of the project. And for the Carbon Components Svelte package alone, there are over 80 contributors. And so like also like just for like background, like this library was released long before SvelteKit, the popular adoption of Vite really came out. And like that has, of course, changed how you might develop component libraries nowadays. But really, like just to start off, in terms of what I would do differently is just going over like the component API design itself. So like just jumping right into like the technical aspect. And just like 4 high-level things to really talk about and focus on would be component composition, using slots over props, avoiding rest props, and then limiting the amount of forwarded native events, and then lastly, naming conventions. So like there are definitely more, but for this talk, this is like really high level and probably the highest priority things that I would consider before if a rewrite were to happen. So starting off, component composition, is it beautiful or is it unwieldy? So Carbon Svelte started as a port of Carbon React, and naturally the tendency was to try to mirror the API. So for example, for the tabs component here, the React corollary looks pretty similar in terms of like having a parent tabs component, and then you would have the actual tabs, the tab labels, and then you would render the actual tab content below. So just looking at this, it does look very readable. It's very declarative. You're composing different components using the default and also the name slots. But one issue that remains to this day is that it's not, so like right now, like this tabs component just will not work if you try to dynamically insert more tabs out of order. So like not just appending them or prepending them, but like, for example, if you if you dynamically render a new tab between tab 1 and tab 2, it'll just lose track of the state and then pretty much assign the wrong variable and like have the wrong tab be highlighted. And this is because the tabs component the parent component uses context. And as the individual tabs are added, it's going to append the ID to the context, but then it's not able to actually track this if you insert them out of order without like touching the actual DOM. And just looking back at this, like this is a pretty huge flaw to not be able to support something like this. The reason why this isn't really an issue in React is because you're able to programmatically iterate over React children. But for Svelte, it's just a bit different. So like really it's by no means the fault or like of Svelte, it's just a different API. There is a workaround which is to use the key block to just recreate it if the tabs themselves change, but it's still not ideal, right? Because then you're just recreating the entire component. So I'll just increase the size of the screen, but like really the Svelte way would be to do something like this, is to really just have one component, and then you just like pass in the actual tabs as one prop, and then use the default slot to render the actual content for that slot. So for example, if the current index is 1, do this, and so on. The issue is that like this is definitely a lot more concise than just one component, but arguably it's a bit less beautiful compared to component composition. So yeah, I mean, I'd be curious to hear what people in the chat think or prefer. But that's just been like a huge flaw that persists to this day. So the second topic would be really like using slots over props. And again, like just going back to the whole idea of wanting to just port the React library over to Svelte, like it doesn't quite map nicely, again, because for props, many components in the Carbon Svelte library have a prop called label text, for example. So just for example, so the idea here is like you would pass in a string for the label for a checkbox, but really this itself is pretty limiting because you're not able to pass actual markup or your own component and really customize it beyond just making it a plain string. And so then the tendency is to try to like make it slotted. But really, like if you look at this, it's like, why not just make it a slot from the get-go? And that's pretty much because in React, you're able to pass in JSX elements as both children and also as props. Svelte does have Svelte component, where you're able to pass in a component and then dynamically render that using Svelte component. But you're not able to pass in a fragment as a prop. So like the lesson here is really for any like composable content or like markup that the end user can customize, just go with a slot. And that's really like the Svelte way. And the next item would be to really avoid using REST props, not just because Svelte has can't really optimize REST props, but for any like spreadable attributes, it's always just possible just to use a prop. So for example, I mean like typically for any like component library, instead of like defining every possible prop at the high level, the idea is to just like pass whatever else the user wants to that corresponding element. So in this case, for the search component, it's like saying like any prop that isn't defined at the very top that isn't exported should just be passed to the underlying input element. And then like typically the REST props, it's not always the highest level element. So for example, for the search component, it's more than just an input. It's actually wrapped by a div. So the REST prop in this case should not be passed to the div, but to the actual input element, because there are more attributes that the user will likely want to customize. And really, like from a mental model standpoint, if you think about the search component, I would just assume that it's just an input component. So like it makes sense from a mental model standpoint to pass it to the input. But again, like in this case, it could just be like a prop that is an object, like for example, like input props, and then just pass that to the input element. Another flaw would be a lot of the native events forwarded to the different elements are just not a good practice. So for example, like only the necessary native events for like hover, click should really be forwarded. And I mean, like just to for like one example would be like in this checkbox component, it's wrapped by a div, but then all of these events are just forwarded to this non-interactive element, which is an ally violation. So it's really not the best practice. And the consumer, can always set these own events when wrapping the component, since the events will bubble up anyways. And like not doing this, like just like taking this out, would also result in a much smaller bundle size, because it's a lot less generated code for Svelte anyways. All right. Yeah, so like onto the fourth point about naming conventions. Yeah, so like when using a component library, it becomes pretty apparent when you use more than one component, when prop names are a bit inconsistent. So right now, like between components, there's like a title text, there's label text. So like revisiting this, it would be nice for the naming itself and the behavior behind those props to be very consistent, so that the end user knows what to expect. And so then the end developer experience is a lot better as well. And also, like one small thing is like for dispatched events, I think the pattern should be that if it's a dispatched event, it should be very semantic, so that just by looking at it, it should be very clear and obvious that it's a custom event as opposed to a forwarded native event. So for example, like one pattern would be to like, just use the on click for the forwarded native events, and then have your own pattern of like on click dash dash close for any event that is dispatched. So one example might be the modal, in which there are multiple buttons. So then these events are just dispatched individually, and it's pretty clear that button primary is a custom event and not a baked-in native event. So I'll just try to pull up the modal just so it's a bit more interactive. So for example, like clicking this would trigger the on-click primary, on-click cancel, and so on. All right, so for the documentation side of things, I think for this, I'd really like to think about what I think was a really good choice, and then what the bad things are that could be improved upon. So I mentioned earlier that what IBM used Svelte for was mainly for internal facing, really small apps. So like think fewer than 10 routes. And Svelte was just like amazing in terms of like saving a lot of time. And if you think about how you use any library, it all comes down to the documentation site and like looking at examples and learning by example as well. So one idea was to really embody the so-called 3-click rule. So in 3 clicks, I should be able to go to the docs site, go to the component page, and then literally just copy the code snippet example that I sort of want to start off from. So for pretty much all of the component docs for Carbon, Svelte, the idea is really just to have the example itself be really accessible and just like copy it and then just build on top of it, essentially. So like no digging around for actual examples, but really just showcase it right here. And then also for each example, provide a live rendered preview of what it looks like, and of course the actual code itself. For the doc setup, it started off as using Storybook because like that's what everyone was using, but honestly, I had trouble with it because this was before the component story format. Again, like this was like 3 years ago. But really, I also found that for Storybook, the generated code that it would use for the examples wasn't correct for Svelte, and then you would also wrap it in another component, if I recall correctly. So since then, we just moved to a custom Routify setup using MDSVEX, so that the actual authoring of components can all just be done. It's just like a flavor of Markdown, and just literally just have the source code be embedded in the actual docs themselves. So like one thing that could definitely be improved upon would be having more than just trivial examples. So the idea for having these basic examples here in the doc site was for it to be as minimal as possible, and really concise as possible. But then at the same time, it's like for a button that might be fine, but for more complex use cases like a data table, it's nice to have more real world examples. So for example, the filtering of the data table. This is the client side in memory built-in search, just like a plain text string matching search for the rows. But then the issue with this is that for like any real use case, you might have like 10,000 rows that you might want to render. And then at that point, it does become like a tad bit sluggish and a lot less performant. So in the docs, it says, note that in-memory filtering is not optimal for large data sets where you might consider using server-side search. But one feedback that we got was that, where's the actual example for this server-side search? Like what do you mean by server-side search? And what's meant here was for any huge data set, it's always better to just use like a full text search engine like Elasticsearch, for example, or Algolia, and then just render what's returned by the server. So really looking at this, this is great for a starter example, but then it would definitely be nice to have, of using a real API, for example, to render real data, just so it's a bit more realistic that way. Yeah, so one big thing would be theming. So Carbon does support, have 4 or 5 out of the box themes from light to dark. One thing that can definitely be improved upon, and I think has been a really common feedback, has been just simply customizing with their own colors. And Carbon does allow that with pretty much any of the all the components already use CSS variables, and it should in theory be very straightforward just to customize the actual token itself, and then have that just apply consistently throughout the actual design system. But unfortunately, this isn't really documented from the Carbon Svelte side at all. And really, if we were to redo this, I think it should be one of the first things, or top priority things, is to really make this a lot easier. And one of the next things would be deviating from the Upstream implementation. So again, the idea for Carbon Svelte was to really just have it be the minimal Svelte markup, and then just apply whatever generated styles from the Upstream Carbon design system to the actual library, and just make that as easy as possible. But there have been cases where a hot fix for our style has been needed, so we'll just inline that fix and then just remove that once the Upstream Carbon styles have been updated. But I think that looking back, it would be nicer just to be a bit more, less restrictive in terms of, um, how we develop this. And I think it's fine. Like, it started off as a port, but I think it's fine if Carbon Svelte goes in its own direction and builds its own components. Like, I mean, like there are some examples of utility components that have been built in Carbon Svelte that have been also, ported back up to the Upstream library. And like one of my favorite components is the recursive list, which uses the Svelte self API, which is awesome, by the way. And like really just makes, for example, like this list, it just takes in a tree and then just renders the items recursively, which is pretty cool. And so like finally, for the documentation and types, so Carbon Svelte is not authored in TypeScript. So it's just plain Svelte/JavaScript. So there is no transpilation step needed to remove types. But the flip side of that is that the corresponding type definitions have to be created. And so there was actually like back in the day, like there was a very simple script that we used just to extract all of the metadata from the components and then just generate the actual type definitions. And it worked pretty well. But we also use that to eventually like generate a lot of the documentation metadata that you see currently on the doc site. So for example, all of this is completely auto-generated. We also have the ability to, again, it's all from the Svelte compiler, but like it's like tell which props are actually reactive, and like that implies that you can bind to it. And yeah, so like other basic metadata like the forwarded events or dispatched events and so on. And that eventually became its own package called Sveld. So really like what's funny about this is that Sveld was sort of like presented as a docgen library first, and then now it's more like a TypeScript gen library. But since SvelteKit package has come out, and I think it does a much more robust job, now it seems like this is also like positioned back to be more of like a docgen library. But in the preview here, like really like it takes in an input of Svelte code, and then it's able to generate the corresponding type definitions using the Svelte component typed interface, JSON, and then also Markdown. So like this Markdown was actually used for, and it's still used for part of the auto-generated docs. So for example, it's the component index right here. I'm not sure if anyone uses this, but I thought it'd be nice just to have like this reference sheet for the actual individual components. Again, it's like the same info, just like the props, slots, events, and so on. So even for Sveld, I think if it could be rewritten, I would have it focused on just being a docgen library primarily, and less about types, especially since Svelte package has, it's like the official way to sort of auto-generate type definitions for component libraries. Awesome. So That's the end of the slides right there. We still have plenty of time, so like please, if there are any questions, I'll open the floor up. And yeah.
Awesome. That was great. You brought up so many things that have been like going through my head lately. So at work, we've been contemplating bringing in an open source design system to replace. We have this custom built, basically a utility CSS kind of design system that's very platform agnostic, but our front end is in Svelte. And so they brought me on to build a Svelte component library, but now we're just trying to look at open source alternatives to try to bring in some components so we have things to get off the ground running. And there's so many things, like as you've built this out, you've had those lessons, like you said, like you've learned some lessons over time. And I kind of just, I have a few questions. And if anybody in the chat has questions, please feel free to butt in at any time. But I had not really thought about avoiding rest props. I know I'd heard like that Svelte can't really optimize them. But I never really thought about like where you're putting them. Like they're bubbling up to that, like you put that for the input, you have to put them on the input. You can't put them on that top level div because you want to make sure you're getting like the correct things on there. And so I'd never really like had that consideration. And so I'm glad that you brought that up. I guess that wasn't really a question. I just wanted to kind of like point that out, that I had not really thought of that. I do have a question on like the slots over props. I guess because it's more verbose for me, I don't know. I still kind of prefer the prop over the slot, with like having to do a fragment or something, or they would, the person consuming it would maybe add in markup where you may not need extra markup. If you use a slot, do you have like anything on that side of it?
Sure. So like, I think like the best example would be, I'll try to find it really quickly. Yeah. So for example, the dropdown component, I think that where slot really shines is it's like the most declarative and expressive way to customize the underlying content. So like just for example, for this dropdown component, I'll try to like increase my screen size just so it's a bit easier to see. But if you actually want to like customize, so like, the dropdown component has its own way of like just rendering whatever like text you pass it in. And like right now it's like the items is like, can be in yeah, like it's a prop, and and like for that, like I think that's actually a lot better, because then you're able to like explicitly set the ID key so that, in each loop in Svelte, each item is keyed for like the optimal performance, and like sorting, for example. But the actual text prop is definitely not very expressive. Like just having a string is very, very constraining. And like, one basic use case is like, I just want to customize, I want to show like an icon or an emoji next to the actual item text. And
I was
like
going
that's
to say,
where,
this drop down would not work well for our product. We have so many different types of drop down select boxes that like need specific markup and things inside of it. So I don't think like that's too restrictive, I think.
to like have
Like
to like
having
not,
just text is too
yeah,
restrictive.
yeah. Oh yeah, definitely. Like it's for sure like not, I mean, like even what if like the text prop was just removed, the text property was removed completely, and then you had to use the default slot just to render the actual item text, for example, or like the actual content or markup, for example. But like point being is like this, I think this is like more of like the Svelte way, in my personal opinion, than like having then like just rely on this again, because unlike React, like yes, you're able to pass in Svelte components.
Yeah.
But then it's like you would have to like customize that component separately, right? It's not inline. So
Yeah, I think I get what you're saying. So the other thing you were saying with the tabs and the keyed block, you were saying that the each block will allow it to like do the correct thing, right? So could the developer that's consuming the component like in the drop down example, if we had the drop down that's like the outside, and then we had a drop down item, if they put an each block around the drop down items and then had a drop down item component that was a singular, would that then solve the problem?
Actually, that would. I would also say that, like, I think that ordering issue, like, I mean, like, dynamically, actually, for that specifically, yes, that would
And
work
for the
fine.
tab too, would that solve it for the tabs as well?
So the tabs one is actually still a bit different, again, because internally, the context is used actually to is to maintain like the current tab.
Okay, so like the
And
active tab.
yes,
Okay, yep.
exactly. So like, I mean, right here, it's like it's really kind of like unwieldy, but like in the parent tabs context, there's like an add method, add content, and then like, so like right now it's like it only supports really like appending like dynamic tabs, but not if you want to like insert it out of order, and then like that's where
I wonder if there's a way to do that with like context and like just doing a custom event. Dispatching.
honestly, it does feel like this should be solved, and like if anyone has any
I'm just like, we're two design system people here, just like spinning on like problems. But yeah, those were just like some of the questions I had about some of your things that you have, problems that you had come up with. And some of them I hadn't even thought of. And then some of them I was like, okay, like I can see where that could be an issue, but maybe I've done it this way before. We have a question from the chat. Eric, did you test a performance? I think it's a good idea to add tests for component time creation, destroying, and also for data addition and deletion.
Yeah, so actually, like that's that's another great point. So awkward, but like right now, there actually are no unit tests, and that actually is very important. I think, especially for like any library that like goes V1, or like even just like development past a certain point, to be able to catch regressions very easily, and like be able to like automate the testing of a component, and like, as you said, like be able to like create the component without any runtime error, be able to like destroy it without any runtime error, and like be able to like test it that way. I've for some like other like individual components that I've open sourced, I've been using Vite and vtest, and have had like a really great experience, and the at testing library / Svelte, and like have had a really great experience so far. So I think that would be the way to go.
I think that's a very important thing. And like, this is something you volunteer for. It's not your job, right?
Oh no, yeah, no, it's like it's been
all just on a volunteer basis. So it's like that's something that we're considering too. It's like, that's why we're looking at open source systems to bring in, because testing is a full-time job. Like they need to be tested, but like you have to be able to do that.
Yeah, I mean, like it really is pretty critical, honestly, especially for like the more complex components where more can go wrong. At least so far, like it's all just been like manually testing by hand, which obviously is not, scalable or ideal by any means. So I think actually, like, yeah, testing would be like is right now is a huge hole in this project, and should be addressed or like prioritized as well.
Yeah, for sure. Unit testing, like you brought up, is important. Someone else in the chat brought up snapshot testing, which is something else that you could bring up, like visual testing of the component once it's actually created and out, something that they use Storybook and Chromatic for. There's other services that offer that to make sure that the visual aspects of the component stay the same from version to version, so you don't lose that.
Yeah, that's a great point, because even with like just like unit testing, it could be it could very well be that where like the actual UI is slightly off. So like that's where snapshotting the actual CSS or like the actual generated styles is important as well. Or like as the user said, like visual snapshot testing, right? And like just like generating images and like comparing the diffs between that.
Yeah, the functionality is just as important as like the visual aspects. Like as a design system, that's one of our goals, is to make sure that we have consistency in the design. So we want to make sure that those visuals are there.
And like beyond that, like there's also like cross-browser testing, because like what might work fine in Chrome might just not work in Safari, for example.
Absolutely.
So like, and like that's where like even like using vtest alone, you know, it's like a JS DOM. So it's like, so you might even have to go farther if you really want to go like be as robust as possible to like use Playwright, or like in actual like headless Chromium or browser to actually do the real tests.
Yeah, I completely agree. I think that those are all like super important things to think about. Someone mentioned that they hadn't heard of Carbon before and that they were waiting on Material Design 3 to come out with. Just something to be aware of that I've heard, and I haven't heard much of Material in Svelte lately. So there is Materialify in Svelte. Like there is a Material version of the Svelte library, but it is not maintained as far as I know. And there are not that many components that are in it. I did look into that a little bit when I was looking into the open source library, but it has not been kept up. So if you're looking for it in Svelte, I don't think that it's quite there. But maybe you can be the person that takes it over. That's the thing with these open source libraries. Like they're always looking for people to volunteer in open source. So where are my notes? Okay, so on the documentation side, we just mentioned Storybook, but I was kind of glad to hear that like you initially started with Storybook and then kind of moved away from that. So I had a similar experience, but I started with Storybook right before 7.0 came out. And so the component story format came out and I was able to work with it, but there's still a lot of workarounds. So they don't support slots. So if you need a slot, you basically have to create an extra component that composes your components together to work with Storybook. And the same thing with like Jest and some other libraries that are more Webpack and not as like friendly to these newer like Vite centric frameworks. For some reason, those older frameworks just don't want to work with slots, and there's not a good API that works well with that yet. I looked at Histoire this morning, and I had looked at it before and didn't really like it, but just looking at something using Histoire looked really nice. And I really like your implementation with like the custom MD specs. But my question for you is that with Markdown, do you think that makes it too developer centric? Do you think it kind of pushes away people like designers and other people that might want to contribute to the documentation?
Yeah, so I think right now that could be another nice addition, is to have, you know, that button where you could like just edit this page on GitHub and then just make that very easy. And like I personally, I think that like MDX is already fairly friendly to like more like non-technical folk, where like, you know, it's easy to like to find the corresponding text in the file and like be able to, you know, like edit that text directly.
Yeah.
But like to answer like the other part of the question, there are like examples where we in the docs where it's like where like it's not inline, where like it has to use an iframe, or I mean like some examples don't have to use it, but it was just easier just to do so. And like for these examples, for example, I'll try to find this really quickly, but I wonder if this is another. So for example, like for the iframed examples, you're able to like preview it completely in isolation. And for these, like we actually have a dedicated file just for that. And honestly, like I actually kind of like this, where like it's like this itself could serve as the basis for a unit test, right? It could be fed into a unit test and then like just have this be tested, and it also serves as the documentation. So like two birds, one stone. Um, but I mean, like just sort of like to sort of answer that question, like it might be nice just to have each example be its own separate file, like actual Svelte file. So like formatting is never an issue, and then just link it to the docs themselves. Actually, like I think for the examples that have to be within an iframe, I think if it uses local storage, I think that's one constraint. Um, so for example, like for the theme, I think this one has to be in an iframe. I'm not sure, like although this one isn't persisting the
What's
theme.
the gotcha with having to use the iframe? What makes it, forces it to use the iframe?
So I think like, for example, like if it uses local storage or like some browser API where it might affect the other examples, I think that was the main reason. So for example,
So if you have multiple components on the page, you can't use those browser APIs with those other components together.
yeah, I mean, like if one uses local storage and then like
Yeah.
another,
They would
like,
interfere with each other.
yeah, it's been a while though. I'll say that.
Yeah, I could see how those would kind of like mix and interfere and get on top of each other. My angle with this and where I was going with that question is that I have more designers that work with the design system than I have. I'm one engineer that works on the design system, and that's it. We have a front end guild, so there's a couple of engineers that join that. But other than that, there's no engineers that really help with the design system. So I would like our documentation site to have any text on the page, to have, like, if you log in with GitHub, to have like an edit button that you could click and the text just be directly editable right there. Now that could be marked down in the code and not exposed to them, but I don't know if I want it to be marked down in either place yet. I haven't really thought that part through. But then once they save that, I don't know if I want it to be like an admin thing where it just publishes automatically and rebuilds the site, or if I want it to like fire a GitHub action and a pull request, and then it could be reviewed.
Like it definitely seems like that feature is kind of like the baseline standard nowadays, or like even like just having like a search bar in the doc site, which is definitely missing here. Like the command K search for like tailwind.css is amazing, for example. But yeah, like I definitely like agree with what you said about like having the whole workflow be streamlined so that like designers can also contribute very seamlessly without having to like get clone and like submit a PR, and like just be able to like just do it through GitHub's UI would be ideal.
Yeah. I agree. I think I'm leaning more towards that GitHub having like some sort of action or webhook or something that will fire, so we have a PR and like an actual review system. That's where my head was kind of going with that question with Markdown. We have another question from the chat. Might be misunderstanding design system. I always wanted the functionality of these component systems while also being able to take my designer's Figma and have more control. I think this is a great question. Do you want to take it?
Yeah, so like is the question
just like what a design system is, and why, like, we're focusing very much on the component framework side of like design systems, but I think just design systems are like lots encompassing of lots of things, and I think that's where the misunderstanding maybe is coming in.
So like I think that in general, like as much as possible, the designer should dictate the direction of the actual design system, and like what's in the Figma files for a designer should have a corresponding implementation from like the code side. I think that if there's any deviation in either side of like having like your own component, I think that's not ideal, like just in my opinion, because that's where like the inconsistency can start happening. Because like for example, like if if you have like a button variant that's like a different color in the implementation that doesn't exist in the design side, the designers wouldn't be able to really use it, and it could be very confusing for the end user. Like where, like if the designer sees the end implementation be so much different from what they have in design. And for Carbon especially, Carbon like has been like a multi-year effort. Hundreds of like designers, developers at IBM like worked on Carbon, so it's a very thorough. Started as a language first, and then like the actual systems themselves. And like Carbon has like the design kits, and just to be clear, like the Figma design kit is also a form of the implementation of the language. The design is like the same thing as like code in a way, right? It's like it's a means to an end. It's not the end goal by any means, right? Like a design system is not like it's not a company's goal to like just to have it as a design system just to like be trendy or cool. It's to make it easy for the designers and developers to do their work, do their jobs, and create something, saving as much time as possible while also having as consistent a product as possible.
Yeah, I think that's a great explanation of it. And I just want to add something to it. I think that a design system can be lots of different things, and I think it kind of scales to the size of what you need. It's the size of like the product that you need it to go to, and it is all encompassing of anything that you need to be a part of that. It can be a Figma UI kit, can be in it, a style guide, a pattern library. Like there can be many things that are in that system, but it's the all encompassing stuff, the language, the tokens, the components, all of that. We're focusing like kind of on the engineering stuff here because this is a coding Svelte stream, but this is like one piece of the whole system. But that is like really what like design systems are. They're all encompassing of like that language of the company, of the product. That's a great question.
Perfect. Yep.
All right. Yeah, Enrico said that they've had Markdown for designers and they've contributed to them with a PR and it was all right. There are some designers I think would be okay with it. I think GitHub scares some designers. I think Markdown scares some designers. So I'm trying to like fill that out. There's only 6 designers, 7 now, I think. We just hired one, 7 designers on the team. So there's not many. And I want to make sure that I'm being aware of everyone's skill set. Yeah, absolutely, Jeff. There was one more thing. Oh, the theming thing. Actually, one thing before I said that. So you showed the filter tables, and filtering is like one thing that we do need. And I'm concerned about like being able to filter and make sure that it is efficient and fast. But also another thing that I noticed in lots of the design systems is that tables are not really responsive by default. They overflow. And I wonder, like, I think we're going to have a Svelte Radio podcast on this because we've talked about it a couple of times. And I'm just like, it drives me crazy that tables don't switch natively, or like there's not an easy CSS way. Anthony like had to send me some like hacky, you have to use a data attribute and you can like make it like go into kind of a grid view instead of the column or the column view. And it's hacky, but it like works. It's just, there's no native way to really do that easily.
Yeah, I mean, like tables especially are a beast. And usually like it's one of like the most, it's also like one of the most core and important components, or like most used. Like if you're building a dashboard, like of course there's probably going to be tables or like some way to like visualize and be able to sort and compare tabular data.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, like for Carbon, well, and I think that like by default, like the native table element, the table layout CSS property is like not fixed by default. So like it'll try to be as responsive as possible. For like your point about like the horizontal overflow, I do feel like in some regards it's not pretty, but like it's almost hard to avoid, especially for like a really narrow screen. It's only natural in a way for like it to just have some overflow and like use your thumb to like scroll to the other side.
Yeah,
But
I guess my question is like for like large data heavy tables, do you think that view with the overflow is better, or like is like having more of a grid view and using responsive CSS to make it a grid view better?
so like again, like just like my personal opinion, I would actually elect for the former. I think that the overflow is fine, even though like it might look it might not look pretty, but like I think it's just the nature of the web. And I mean, like just like spreadsheets in general, like it always has that horizontal and vertical overflow. It's just like it's a part of the affordance of that type of UI.
Yeah.
But yeah, like just my personal opinion.
Okay, that makes sense. That's fair. I did want to touch on the custom theming a bit, because that was one of my concerns with grabbing Carbon, was that custom theming was going to be a bit of a beast. And I mean, I do know like we could use the CSS variables, but one thing with doing that is you have to align with that framework's variables. So if we pull in that, we would have to go with whatever Carbon's token names are, their variable names, and then just overwrite them, right?
Yep.
Or I'm digging into each component individually and updating the tokens and the variable names there. So there's trade-offs on doing something like that. So you were mentioning though that you wish there was a better way for custom theming for brands, right?
Yes, like as in like total control over everything, like over like it glow. So like the one thing with like a design system is like, I'm not sure if I'm still sharing my screen. I'm just looking at the doc site for Carbon Svelte, but like what I've
Yeah,
seen.
sorry, I forgot we were sharing that. I can't take if you need to,
Oh,
I can remove it after we're done here.
awesome. So like one thing I've seen before, and like which is totally valid, is like people like overwriting the actual CSS directly, like say like this, like
Yeah.
and like or like just targeting like all the BTN primary classes. This is totally valid and acceptable, but the idea for like a design system is like the hover state is one thing, and also like if you juxtapose this component with another component that uses the interactive color, it's going to look mismatched. So I think for design system, like there has to be some global tokens that you're able to override, or at least be able to control in some way. I think that's like the much better way, and like Carbon CSS, it's architected for this very reason. So and I'll say this is like I sort of also wish that Carbon had like a utility CSS approach, or like if that's even possible, because I think that like right now it's like very semantic classes. I'm not sure what like this naming convention is called. Like
It's
like there,
BIM, right? Block
yeah,
element
like
software.
there's some convention, right, where like the suffix, but like point being is like it's very like it has its own,
Contextual.
but, like yes, but like I'll admit that like I'm a Tailwind convert, so
Yeah.
it's a shame to like not be able to just like add in like a few classes and like it just applies the styles for you, and like that's amazing.
That was one of the things that really kind of honestly, and just to be upfront about it, was like drew me a little bit away from Carbon, was that to make anything custom on my own was going to be really difficult. I either needed to learn the
Yeah.
naming convention, or everything is very contextual to the component level, and I need to like know those class names to create something. And there's not a lot of utility classes outside of those.
Yeah, totally. And like I've seen that feedback a lot, and like I'll also just say like upfront, I also agree. I think with the hard coded classes, it's very like if there's like for example if there is like an upstream bug in the styles, then like we have to hotfix it somehow, and like it's very unwieldy, and like, it's not like we can just use like the functional utility classes like just to fix it by ourselves. So it's definitely more restricting that way, and especially like I think even the markup itself, it's got to be in the exact order, because some styles might target child, like direct descendant selectors, for example, and like that's where it can get kind of gnarly, right? Like it's very rigid in a way.
Yep. Totally get that. Well, I think I covered most of my questions. I think I could do a whole nother hour on just like the documentation and how you do all of that and your tooling for like the actual setup of the library itself, the tooling for the documentation site. I could do all of that, but I will not keep you any longer today. I don't see any more questions in the chat either. We do have another live stream. I'm getting all the requests now coming in. We're having Lacey Peavy back on to do a Medusa live stream next month on August 3rd. I think it's going to be at 1 Eastern. So please come and join us for that one as well. I'm excited to be back on and streaming again. Thank you so much, Eric. This was so great. Like I said, I'm so passionate about this stuff. I could continue talking about it for so long, but thank you for joining me, and I'll now remove your screen so we're not talking over that.
And like, thanks so much for having me on.
Yeah, thank you. All right, everyone. We'll see you next time. Thanks for joining.
Take care.